давайте, быстрее, 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 быстрее. Оттягуйте його. Оттягуйте.
The images we have just seen transport us to the heart of one of the most devastating conflicts of our time. At every moment, the tension and courage of the Ukrainian soldiers come to life, revealing the brutal confrontation that continues to rage in the Donetsk region, a key point in the conflict. The forces of Kyiv are not willing to give up ground so easily. The 80th Air Assault Brigade, nourished by the savage fighting taking place in the country, prepares a violent assault against its enemies. The objective to recover positions and surround the invading troops. In the midst of chaos, hope and sacrifice emerge as inseparable elements of this devastating war. A scenario where anything goes and in which hunting down enemies has a crucial strategic value, whether alive or dead. In this new video from Military Force, we invite you to learn everything about this spectacular Ukrainian counteroffensive to defeat Putin's forces and recover what rightfully belongs to them, their country. Let's begin. In the midst of the devastating war that has ravaged Ukraine since the Russian invasion, which began on February 24, 2022, the 80th Air Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces has proven to be one of the most formidable bastions in the fight to defend the national territory. This elite force is designed for high-risk and maximum-intensity missions, a unit that has forged its reputation in the fiercest battles of the war against Russia. Specialized in airborne operations, these soldiers are accustomed to being deployed to the most critical points on the front, where combat is bloody and the odds of survival become daunting. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, the 80th Brigade has been instrumental in defending strategic positions and taking the attack directly to the heart of the enemy. The counteroffensive led by President Volodymyr Zelensky has intensified in the final months of 2024. Specifically in the town of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, a strategic and symbolic point for both forces. This phase of the fight has marked a turning point. For months, the 80th Brigade had been honing its counteroffensive tactics, facing an enemy brutally determined to hold on to every square meter of land. The fight in this instance has not only been about territorial control. Bakhmut, once a vibrant Ukrainian city, became a battlefield where thousands of soldiers have given their lives in the name of sovereignty and honor. After the assault on Bakhmut, the Ukrainian strategy took a drastic change as they advanced towards Andriivka. This city was a bastion defended by Putin's forces, who resisted multiple counterattacks in previous months. The 80th Brigade, reinforced by artillery and air cover, decided to launch a coordinated attack, betting everything in an attempt to break through the enemy lines. The roads, once passable, were now full of craters and rubble, marked by the traces of intense fighting. The landscape was one of hopelessness and resistance, with every soldier willing to risk his life to regain control of his homeland. The situation was further complicated by the presence of civilians trapped in this nightmare. The few inhabitants who remained in Andriivka found refuge in basements and makeshift shelters, struggling to survive amid uncertainty and fear. Supplies of food and medicine were scarce, and various attempts to get humanitarian aid to them have been impossible due to the incessant enemy fire. The preparations for this counterattack were intense. Ukrainian officers, including commanders of the 80th Brigade, carefully monitored the planning from a nearby command post. Zelensky's intelligence had detected Russian troop movements, which had reinforced their positions in Andriivka, turning the town into a fortress. Nevertheless, military leaders knew that the time was right to launch a counteroffensive.
Завдання взяти штурмом декілька окопів, які знаходяться в лісовій посадці. Отже, ми висуваємося з точки, пересуваємося тихим методом та штурмуємо посадку.
Останні кілька тижнів ми бачимо успіх на цій ділянці,
Так.
що значно вдалося просунутися.
Звісно, так. Ми працюємо майже через день, тобто дійсно роботи дуже багато, але вона стоїть того.
The road to Andriivka was a death trap. Every step of the Ukrainian soldiers was marked by the uncertainty of death lurking nearby. Russian artillery never ceased its bombardment, turning the land into a hell of explosions and shrapnel. Ukrainian troops advanced with extreme caution, knowing that at any moment the ground could open beneath their feet or the skies could vomit fire upon them. The danger was not only at the front, but also in every corner. Hidden mines, booby traps, and constant airstrikes. As the battle progressed, the Russian resistance, initially firm and aggressive, began to fragment. On the one hand, the constant pressure of Ukrainian attacks, well organized and backed by Western military technology, overwhelmed the Russian defensive lines. The Kremlin soldiers, subjected to more precise Ukrainian artillery and offensives on multiple fronts, began to lose cohesion. First-person combat footage shows the devastating advance of Kyiv's forces.
Чисто? Єна, я тут в укритті. Ми перебігли, ми зафіксувались в укритті тут. Цинкуй 12.
Amid shattered trenches and fallen soldiers, Ukrainian forces advanced under relentless fire. Rubble could be seen everywhere, and soldiers moving towards enemy lines. Always advancing, always pressing. Andriivka became a hand-to-hand combat zone where members of the 80th Brigade fought fiercely in half-destroyed buildings and mud-filled trenches. Russian forces tried to resist the counterattack as best they could. It was a game of chess where strategy and, above all, will would give victory to one of the two sides. At a crucial moment, Zelensky's forces managed to outflank the Russians, forcing them to retreat towards the inner positions of the city. The capture of Andriivka by the Ukrainians was a decisive moment. From this position, the troops launched a series of counteroffensives around the town, continuing to put pressure on the Russian enemies who were defending the place tooth and nail. The fighting intensified in this phase, with Putin's troops launching constant attacks in a desperate attempt to recapture Andriivka and stop the Ukrainian advance.
По левую сторону.
Amid this brutal campaign, Ukrainian units played a pivotal role in consolidating the most advanced positions on the ground. Equipped with modern artillery supplied by Western allies, Ukrainian forces maintained constant pressure on Russian positions, preventing them from reorganizing or bringing in reinforcements. With terrifying precision, their units worked side by side with gunners and drone pilots, orchestrating a ballet of destruction in the sky that left Putin's forces on the defensive.
Оце, власне, наші хлопці працюють артою. Ми спостерігаємо розрив в нашій посадочці. Ну, не в нашій, в їхній. Це от виходить, що при таких постійних вибухах, при таких от постійних прильотах ніхто особливого бажання піднімати голову не має. Це дає можливість нашим хлопцям підійти достатньо близько, щоб вже стало пізно піднімати голову.
The advance continued for weeks, with Zelensky's forces moving into the area from multiple fronts. The counteroffensive was meticulously planned and executed with precision. The assaults of the 80th Brigade, coordinated with other Ukrainian units, ensured that the enemy could not find a respite. Russian trenches were shelled relentlessly, and Ukrainian infantry forces advanced in constant waves, pushing the Russians back step by step. After months of heavy fighting, Ukrainian soldiers had reached the outskirts of the town of Andriivka, a key symbol of Russian resistance in the region. Despite the audacity of the Western-backed forces throughout this period, the path to victory would not be so easy or linear. Russian troops, with their vast experience and significant deployment of resources, were not willing to give ground without fierce resistance. Ukrainians had to endure intense bombardment, surprise attacks, and a war of attrition that tested their physical and mental endurance. At each attempt to advance towards strategic points such as Andriivka and Bakhmut, Ukrainian units faced a formidable line of defense, which included not only heavy artillery and ambush tactics, but also a considerable number of soldiers willing to fight to the last breath. In this difficult context, a specialized anchor team established defensive and support positions on the ground, an essential tool to maintain the effectiveness of forces on the battlefield. This unit forms fortified sites including barricades, temporary emplacements, and other elements that protect soldiers from enemy fire and provide them with a solid base from which to launch counterattacks. The last phase of the battle was particularly bloody. The fighting in Donetsk became a mix of urban tactics and trench warfare, with Ukrainian troops fighting street by street, building by building. The Russians, cornered and increasingly desperate, launched frantic attacks that were repelled with great difficulty by Zelensky's forces. Amid gunpowder and smoke, the soldiers infiltrated the ashes of the city. Each step was a mix of tension and adrenaline, knowing that death could lurk around the corner.
Нахуй, пи***сы! Сюда, блядь, из оружия! Сдавайся, уёбок! Сдавайся, пидорас!
In one of the fiercest clashes, Ukrainian soldiers managed to breach Putin's defenses, surrounding a contingent of enemy troops who, after hours of fighting, finally surrendered. Images of kneeling, unarmed Russian soldiers surrounded by Ukrainian forces have become a grim symbol of the current phase of the war. The dejected faces of the captured soldiers, under the watchful gaze of their captors, reflect the unexpected turn of the battle. What was once a determined advance by Russia has now turned into a forced retreat, with its troops on the verge of collapse in some areas. These prisoners, handing over their weapons without resistance, represent not only the capture of territory, but also the erosion of Russian morale in the face of the unstoppable push of the Ukrainian soldiers. Zelensky's forces, caught up in the maelstrom of fighting, were shifting their focus from simply trying to regain ground to hunting down their enemies, those Russian soldiers who, caught in a tangle of destruction, could become valuable carriers of information. Sometimes, though, when the risk of capturing them is too high, a more drastic decision has to be taken.
Є, бачу. Жди.
Прицелься добре.
Every corner of Andriivka became a combat arena, where life and death coexisted in a delicate balance. Every action was punctuated by the stifled cry of human suffering, reminding that, in this war, destruction is not only physical, but also emotional. One of the most symbolic moments was the capture of a group of high-ranking Russian officers whose positions had been compromised by the relentless advance of Kiev's forces. The taking of these soldiers marked a psychological victory, both for the men at the front and for the Ukrainian nation as a whole. Once captured, the officers are disarmed and subjected to interrogations in which units seek crucial information about enemy positions, supply depots, and any Russian offensives heading to the front.
Да, можно. Давайте, быстрее. Оттягуйте його. Оттягуйте.
Ремич, отягнете, прикриєте, щоб ми закрили ту залупу.
Давай. Звання.
А полутайте його, документи, блядь, і допрос проведіть, блядь.
Документов нет. Майор.
Документів немає. Каже, що звання майор. Як прийняв? Сказав, що сьогодні зайшло 120 людей. Взагалі десь було 160 з них. З'їбалось 50-60.
Они все утром.
As reported by the captured soldier, the Russians appeared to have retreated to safer positions. However, the victory of the 80th Air Assault Brigade and the other units in the Donetsk region did not come without a high cost. The casualties on both sides were horrendous. As of this writing, the death toll in the war between Russia and Ukraine is difficult to accurately verify. Estimates based on independent reports and government sources put the death toll at around 100,000 Ukrainian and approximately 200,000 Russian casualties since the start of this seemingly never-ending conflict. The bodies of fallen soldiers strewn across the battlefields are silent witnesses to the brutality of this conflict. However, the determination of the Ukrainian forces, their ability to coordinate effective attacks, and their unwavering resilience on the front lines have allowed them to make crucial gains in a war that is now more than 2 years old. The battle for Donetsk and the surrounding region has shown that, while the enemy is powerful, Ukraine's will to defend its land is even greater. Every meter recaptured by the 80th Brigade and other units is not only a territorial victory, but an assertion of that country's sovereignty and dignity in the face of an enemy that has sought to annihilate it. With the capture of Andriivka and the advances towards Bakhmut, the 80th Air Assault Brigade has cemented its place in modern Ukrainian history as a heroic, determined, and effective unit. However, the war is far from over. Russia remains a formidable enemy. And although it has suffered significant defeats in recent months, it still controls vast areas of the east of the country. The future of the conflict will depend largely on Ukraine's ability to maintain momentum in its counteroffensives, as well as the continued support of its international allies. But one thing is clear. This brigade and Zelensky's forces as a whole have shown that they will not give up easily. Now, after learning how Ukraine is counterattacking Russia in this all-out war, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again in our next military force video.